Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Thursday, March 21st, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about the 2024 GOP primary. And yes, even after Nikki Haley has dropped out, there are indicators here within some of these more important battleground states that Donald Trump is weaker than we otherwise might have thought, especially given that he is now running uncontested in the 2024 GOP primary. Now, this is an article from the New York Magazine talking about zombie votes for Nikki Haley. Essentially, what that means is these are votes out there that despite her being dropped out of the race, you find that voters are still turning out to the ballot box to cast their ballot for Nikki Haley. And a lot of the analysis on this has largely been that in many of these states, it is voters here rejecting Donald Trump as the presumptive nominee, saying that despite him being the only one still remaining in the race, they would rather have somebody else. And so Nikki Haley, being one of the few people who has actually qualified for a number of states that are upcoming and have recently passed over the past 2 weeks since she dropped out of the race after Super Tuesday, she is their go-to to express displeasure with Donald Trump being the nominee. Now, what's interesting about zombie votes is that they aren't always indicators of support going to other parts of the party, to the opposition. In some cases, voters are in fact voting for a candidate just simply because it's fun, right? It's not really just a matter of, displeasure with President Trump. You often find that candidates who have spent $0 in fundraising and advertising in some very large states and in some interesting presidential primaries will just capture votes because they are on the ballot. Now, that's not to say that, at all trying to discredit the performance of Nikki Haley, even after she has dropped out of the race, but to more acknowledge that it wouldn't be necessarily shocking if Nikki Haley was on the ballot but not being in the race, receiving 5 to 6% of the vote. But that isn't what she's receiving. Zombie votes always exist. Candidates who aren't actively seeking an election despite being on the ballot still receive votes for a variety of different reasons. But this one seems very, very intentional. Now, the first warning sign, I will say, came when the state of Georgia and the state of Washington held their primary a week after Nikki Haley had dropped out of the race. In Washington, Nikki Haley received 20% of the vote, and in Georgia, she received 13%. But the issue here wasn't the percentage, and it wasn't that she was coming within, a lot closer than anyone even expected. The fact is that she was receiving roughly 1 in 10 voters in Georgia and 1 in 5 Republican voters in Washington after she had dropped out of the race. And it was also the raw vote number in Georgia that I think alarmed many Republicans here. Nikki Haley received 77,000 votes despite being a dropped-out candidate in a race that Donald Trump lost by a margin of just 12,000 votes. It was a lot closer than I think people really expected in 2020, especially the Trump campaign, which expected to demolish Joe Biden in the state of Georgia, which meant that every single thing mattered in this state. Georgia was the closest state of the 2020 presidential election, and nothing can be left up to chance this time around. But Republicans and the Trump campaign were quick to dismiss the results of the Georgia Republican primary and the Washington Republican primary, largely because they were held in what we call open states, which means regardless of your political party affiliation, you can vote in the opposition party's primary, including Democrats, independents, and of course, Republicans voting in the GOP primary. And so there wasn't a perfect way of assessing this, but the warning sign here was this, and the Republican campaign wrote it off, but Nikki Haley received 77,000 votes. The interesting thing about this is that less than 20,000 voters in the 2024 GOP primary ended up voting in the Democratic primary back in 2020. And so there wasn't as much Democratic crossover as Republicans were initially letting on, ultimately indicating these numbers weren't super strong and weren't amazing performances for President Trump, especially given that he was the only one not in the race. But then came another primary. A primary that would sort of change the way I looked at these and the way that many other people have looked at these. And they came down in the state of Florida, where Nikki Haley received 14% of the vote 2 weeks after she had dropped out of the presidential race. And while 14%, again, is not a number that I would say was shocking or at all invigorating or would all, indicate that Nikki Haley should re-enter into the race or that somehow she should be considered, for an alternative nominee choice in 2024. No, that is not what is happening here. But the raw vote numbers, I think, are on its own alarming. You see, I could have bought into, and I think I did buy into for a while, writing off Georgia and Washington as states, they have open primaries, it really doesn't matter here, Donald Trump is performing the way that Donald Trump performs, and maybe there are some upset Democrats who are switching over to the Republican side just to vote against Trump because they want to stop Trump any way they can. And I bought that. I think that made a lot of sense in states like New Hampshire, where you did see Democrats actively campaigning to vote for Nikki Haley on this simple fact that they didn't like Donald Trump. They didn't want Donald Trump to be the nominee for president of the United States. But now we're looking at it from a different lens. Florida helps us look at it from the Republican lens, because the only people who could vote in the GOP primary in Florida are registered Republicans, not Democrats, not independents. It didn't matter. You have to be a registered Republican to vote in this primary. Now, the other point of interest here is that Florida is one of the few states back in the 2020 presidential election that shifted to the right. It's one of the few states that ended up being more pro-Democrat, more pro-Republican than it had in 2016, despite national shifts moving towards Joe Biden, moving towards the Democratic Party. Areas like Miami-Dade and Broward County saw significant shifts from 2016. Broward County only shifted 5 points, but in Miami-Dade, it was 22 points. And many other parts of the state ultimately shifted towards the right. And that helped Donald Trump. But this is also his home state now. This is where Mar-a-Lago is. This is where he claims to be from. And now it is his most, favorite state. The one he's hosting a number of rallies at. The one that he feels so passionately about. Donald Trump loves Florida, and evidently the Florida Republican Party loves him. But to an extent. Nikki Haley received 155,000 votes. 155,000 votes in the Florida Republican primary, despite being 2 weeks out of the race. These zombie votes are real, and they aren't just happening in open states. The argument here was that everyone should write this off because it was Democrats, Democrats, Democrats. It was Democrats. It was Antifa. It was the people against Trump because they're afraid of him becoming the next president. But what's to say there are Republicans out there being afraid of Donald Trump becoming the next president? You don't go out and vote for a candidate who has no shot because she has dropped out and Donald Trump has already won the nomination, unless you were upset with him, unless you desperately did not want him to be the nominee. And that's the question here. With these votes and these zombie votes exposing a weakness of Donald Trump in closed primary states, in open primary states, in swing states like Arizona, where Nikki Haley received nearly 20% of the vote in this state. What we are finding is that the 2024 GOP primary here, the votes that are going to Nikki Haley, a large chunk of them are, in fact, Republican. That's why you see a state like Georgia and Florida nearly identical regardless of party affiliation or party line voting. This is a sign here that there are disgruntled Republicans that are really upset with Donald Trump being the nominee and are voting for Nikki Haley but might not be voting for Trump in this coming November election. And when we saw what happened after Nikki Haley dropped out of the race, we saw that her entire donor base was left without a nominee. They were left without somebody to back. And a huge chunk of them, the majority of them, didn't go to Donald Trump, didn't go to another Republican, instead went to Joe Biden. Think about somebody like Mark Cuban, who very publicly has been a supporter of, simple common sense politics for what he declares to be common sense, right? Republicans and Democrats, regardless of who it is, regardless of the party, he's endorsing who he genuinely believes would be best for the country. And so that's Mark Cuban's take. He's a billionaire. You can decide whether or not you trust his take here, but he is one of the main people who was funding Nikki Haley, who was backing Nikki Haley, a very, very big name, and someone who has been an adamant supporter against Donald Trump, but was willing to be a conservative, willing to be on the Republican side for Nikki Haley. Now, he was, again, a supporter of Nikki Haley, but after she lost, immediately went over to President Biden, not only, begrudgingly so, attended a fundraiser, hit the ground running immediately for Joe Biden because he sees Donald Trump as more of a threat than liberal ideology, than 4 years of what they would declare to be bad policy. And it's that type of conservative thinking and that type of conservative pushback in states like Florida, in Arizona, in Georgia, and Washington that Republicans should be looking out for. Because you can also see a story being told not just in the percentages for Nikki Haley and the amount of raw votes for Nikki Haley in these crucial battleground states, it's also in the regions in which Trump's support is the worst. What we have noticed as a consistent factor in these states where he is underperforming or just not doing as well as he should be as the only person on the ballot is that the driving vote base for Nikki Haley or for other Republicans on the ballot, and has been the case when other Republicans were on the ballot in states like Iowa and New Hampshire and Nevada and South Carolina, is that it is these suburban regions of these states that seem to like Trump the least. And the one part of the country the Republicans used to rely on heavily for consistent victories in states like Arizona, like Georgia, are the suburban regions that Republicans seem to be losing and losing and losing. When you take a look at the shift from 2016, a lot of Georgia, in fact, did have a bunch of red. But you know what was entirely blue? The Atlanta metro area And it wasn't because urban voters were getting out there tremendously. They turned out and they showed up. Black voters turned out for President Biden. But you know who also turned out for President Biden? White suburban women. That's exactly what happened in this Atlanta metro region. Why areas like DeKalb County saw significant shifts, and Cobb County saw a 12-point shift. Gwinnett, 12 points. Fulton, 5 points, right? Fayette County, 12 points. Henry County. This region of the state that largely led President Biden to victory. Vote dumps relative to 2016 that helped him win the state despite many of the rural areas shifting towards the right. It's a consistent problem, too, that we can see very apparent in the state of Arizona when you see Maricopa County getting 5 points more Democratic. Hillary Clinton lost Maricopa County in 2016. And when you lose Maricopa County, chances are you lose the state. Joe Biden won it narrowly, and that's because of the 5-point shift. When you take a look at a state like Virginia, which shifted significantly to the left, despite 2016 having the vice presidential nominee being from Virginia, Virginia became a Biden double-digit state. Why? Because their entire suburban region in Northern Virginia shifted to the left. It was a consistent problem for Republicans and one that doesn't seem to be getting better within this GOP primary or getting better ahead of 2024. Nikki Haley donors are switching to Joe Biden. People like Mark Cuban are switching to Joe Biden. And now Republicans are voting against Trump in key primaries as this early warning sign that he still has not won them over. And when he adopts rhetoric like pushing out Republicans and his nominees, people like, for instance, Bernie Moreno in Ohio, who came out today on Fox News and said, if you are interested in going to the party of Mitt Romney and John Kasich, then you have another option, and that is Sherrod Brown. That is not how you make a big tent party. That is not how you capture in these 155,000 registered Republicans who voted for Nikki Haley. That is not a winning strategy. And I think the Trump campaign is too, caught up in their weeds to notice that there still is support for other candidates that aren't Donald Trump. He might be the only one in the race, but it certainly doesn't look that way. And I think at the end of the day, in order to win an election that was decided by 44,000 votes, 11,000 in Arizona, 12,000 in Georgia, 20,000 in Wisconsin, 44,000 votes out of over 150 million votes would have made all the difference had they voted for Donald Trump. In fact, take that in half and add just 22,000 votes plus 22,001 in favor of Donald Trump compared to where they would have voted otherwise, Trump would have won re-election. And so when we see this, and when we see that Trump, despite, I think it's different from 2020 because he was the nominee in 2020. There was no major contest. There was no Republican primary debates or consideration that he could lose or adamant Republicans out there saying, he's not my guy. I think things have changed since then. Things like January 6th, things like his handling of classified documents or a hush money case or the election, right? Every single thing that I think Democrats are now using against him have all happened post-presidency with the exception of his handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. And you find here the Republicans are turning their backs on Donald Trump. They didn't all of a sudden just scoot into the Trump camp because I think many of them feel pushed out. I think many of them feel is that they aren't represented. And it's that mentality here. People like Mark Cuban who believe that you can survive 4 years of policy you don't agree with, but you cannot survive 4 years of Donald Trump. And so we've been talking a lot about donors. We've been talking about these actual primaries, but what about those polled Haley supporters? Well, in the most recent Reuters and Ipsos poll, Joe Biden edges out Donald Trump by 1 percentage point, 39-38. When push comes to shove, the voters choose Joe Biden, 51-49. And why might that be? Well, a number of undecided voters do, in fact, lean left, but a good number of Republican voters that were Nikki Haley supporters in the GOP contest here, 37% of them said they're voting for Trump. 16% said they would vote for Biden, and the rest said they would either not vote or vote for somebody else. Well, when Nikki Haley is getting 77,000 votes in Georgia, and you're only getting 37% of that support, Donald Trump doesn't gain well. Donald Trump needs the Nikki Haley supporters more than Joe Biden does. What you're finding here is the reason why, Joe Biden's lead is narrower versus when you actually push voters to make a decision is because these Nikki Haley supporters who will probably make it out to the ballot box to vote in some instance, 16% of them are already on the Biden train. And when push comes to shove, it looks like a lot more of them end up moving over. I think a lot of them have this philosophy that they are never Trump. They may have been never Trump from 2016, held their nose and voted for him because they thought Hillary Clinton was corrupt. He was the incumbent, so they just stuck with him in 2020. But now they had another option. And for many of them, they feel like they've been cheated out of this option. That the party treated Trump as the presumptive nominee. That there was never an urgency behind debates or questioning the decision that Trump should or should not be the Republican nominee for president. And for many of them, they saw Nikki Haley as their last hope. But for a good chunk of them too, they see Joe Biden as their next chance to return to a party of conservatism. That beating Joe Biden isn't as important as beating Donald Trump, because Donald Trump will keep the party in this right-wing extremism and lose them future elections. But the party of Nikki Haley is the winning party, at least to them, and based on the numbers that we see, is probably something that many people can agree with. The question is now, what happens as we get closer to this election? What happens to this roughly 50% that said they would vote for somebody else or not at all? If they move over to Trump, that's really good for him. But chances are they're not. And chances are Joe Biden does, in fact, gain more and more support as more Nikki Haley donors move over, as more Nikki Haley supporters move over, and as this race comes back to being what it was in 2020 of Trump versus Biden, which is a place many Republicans simply do not want to see happen because they do not want Donald Trump to be president. And so the question will be for them as well. Who do you vote for now that you're faced up against these two? And the answer might shock many of us. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist from my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.